She slammed her tray of bread onto the ground. Right there. Right in the middle of the Red Hollow Market. In front of everyone. Not because she dropped it. Because Thomas Whitaker had just knocked it out of her hands deliberately. With the back of his arm, like it was nothing, like she was nothing, and then turned to the crowd and laughed. "See?" he said, loud enough for the whole square to hear. "Can't even hold on to a tray of bread. And she wants you to trust her with your money." Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Evelyn Carter stood in the dirt, surrounded by her ruined loaves, with 50 people watching, and not one of them stepped forward. If this story reaches something inside you, subscribe to our channel. Follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. She did not cry. That was the first thing people noticed, and it made them angrier than if she had. Evelyn Carter crouched down in the dirt of the Red Hollow Market Square, in front of 50 witnesses, and began picking up her bread. One loaf at a time. Slow, methodical, deliberate. She checked each one. Set aside the ones that could be salvaged. Left the ones that couldn't. Her hands did not shake. Thomas Whitaker was still talking behind her. She could hear him, the way you hear rain on a roof, constant. Background. Something you've stopped trying to block out. That's the problem with people like her, he was saying to the two men beside him. Loud enough to perform for the crowd. They don't know when to quit. They keep setting up, keep failing, keep making everyone else uncomfortable watching it. At some point, it's not determination anymore. It's stubbornness. And stubbornness doesn't put food on anyone's table. Someone in the crowd laughed. Evelyn placed the last salvageable loaf into her basket and stood up. She looked at Thomas Whitaker. He was a big man, wide, prosperous-looking, with the particular confidence of someone who had never once in his life been the smallest person in the room. He met her gaze with an expression that was almost bored, like a man who had already won and was just waiting for the other side to realize it. "Are you finished?" Evelyn said. The crowd went quiet. Thomas tilted his head slightly. The bored expression didn't change. "I'm just speaking plainly, Evelyn. Someone has to. You knocked my bread onto the ground," she said. Her voice was level, completely level. "You did it on purpose. Front of witnesses, because you needed everyone watching to feel what you wanted them to feel about me." She picked up her basket. "So yes, someone is speaking plainly today. I just don't think it's you." She walked back to her table. Behind her, she heard Thomas say something low and dismissive to the men beside him. She heard a few people move away from the scene. She heard, under all of it, the particular silence of a crowd that had just watched something they weren't entirely sure what to do with. She set her basket down, straightened her remaining display, adjusted the cloth. Her hands were steady, inside her chest. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. But her hands were steady. That was the part she had worked hardest to learn. Red Hollow, Wyoming. Summer of 1888. It was not a cruel town. Exactly. Most towns weren't, when you examined them up close. They were collections of ordinary people trying to make ordinary lives work. And ordinary people were not naturally given to cruelty. But ordinary people were given to stories. They needed stories, a way to make sense of who belonged where, who was rising, who was falling, who was safe to admire, and who was safe to look down on. Evelyn Carter had become a story. It had happened gradually, the way most things happened in a town this size, one piece at a time, laid down over years until the picture was so complete that nobody could imagine questioning it. The story went like this. Evelyn Carter was a woman who couldn't finish what she started. She had tried to run a food business and failed. She had tried to have a life with a man and failed. She kept trying things, and they kept not working, and at some point, trying became its own kind of evidence against her. Because if you kept trying and kept failing, then surely the problem was not the circumstances, but the person. That was the story. Evelyn knew it as well as anyone. Better, probably. She had inherited the farmhouse from her father when he passed 6 years ago, a small, exhausted building 2 miles east of town, at the edge of a dry creek that only ran water in the spring. Harold Carter had been a proud man who worked hard and saved carefully and still died with almost nothing, which was less a reflection on Harold Carter than on what life in frontier Wyoming did to men who worked hard and saved carefully. What he left Evelyn was the farmhouse, a tin box of her mother's recipes, and the particular kind of inheritance that can't be counted in dollars, the absolute conviction that work was the only honest answer to any problem. Evelyn had taken that conviction and applied it immediately and completely. She had spent 14 months fixing the farmhouse herself, patching the roof, rehanging the door, scrubbing the floors, rebuilding the kitchen from the inside out with salvaged wood and second-hand tools and the kind of stubborn physical effort that leaves your hands cracked and your shoulders aching for weeks. She had sourced her supplies carefully, traveling farther than anyone expected her to for better prices. She had practiced her mother's recipes until they were not just reproductions but improvements, things she understood from the inside out, could adjust by instinct, could rebuild from memory in the dark. She had opened her table at the Red Hollow Market in the spring of 1883. For 5 months it had worked, not spectacularly, not in the way of a story with a clean arc and a satisfying climax. It had worked the way real things work, slowly, inconsistently, with good weeks and bad weeks, and 1 week in August that was so good she had let herself cry a little when she got home because she couldn't hold the relief inside anymore. Then the winter came. Not just any winter. The winter of 1883 and Rugly was the kind of winter that old-timers would still be talking about 20 years later. The kind that arrived 3 weeks early and didn't leave until March had nearly given up trying. 11 days of unbroken storm, 4 feet of snow on the roads. Supplies she had calculated so carefully, preserved and rationed and protected against a normal winter, were simply not enough for an abnormal one. When the storm broke, half her stores were ruined. She had gone to Gerald Pierce because she had no other option. She had known Gerald Pierce's reputation. Everyone in Red Hollow knew his reputation. But when you are out of options, you sometimes have to choose between bad and catastrophic. And Gerald Pierce was merely bad. She had borrowed what she needed. She had paid him back. She had found out 3 weeks later that he had charged her 38% above market rate. By then the damage was done. The debt had eaten her margins. The customers who drifted away during the storm didn't all return. And the whispers had started quiet at first, almost gentle, the way whispers always were before they gathered weight. I heard she's struggling. She's not very good with money. I'm not sure the operation is stable enough to be trusted with a regular order. Thomas Whitaker had not started those whispers. But he had found them useful, and he was a man who knew how to be useful back. Thomas had been the dominant merchant in Red Hollow for over a decade. He sold supplies, dry goods, livestock feed, tools, seed, the infrastructure of daily life in a frontier town. His position was not just commercial, it was social. He decided, in ways that were never quite explicit but always clearly understood, who in Red Hollow was credible and who wasn't, who could be trusted and who couldn't. He had never had a direct competitor, and he had never wanted one. And Evelyn's little food operation, small as it was competition in the category he cared about most: influence. If people trusted Evelyn, they trusted someone Thomas didn't control. That was enough. He had worked on her reputation carefully and consistently for 3 years. Never lying outright, he was too smart for that. Just framing. Just emphasis. Just the particular art of letting other people draw the conclusions you wanted them to draw. She's not dishonest, he would say, which sounded like a compliment until you heard what came next. She's just not reliable, and reliability is what a business runs on. When Daniel Marsh left, when the fiancée Evelyn had spent 2 years building a future with chose Margaret Holloway and her family's money instead, Thomas had not said a word. He hadn't needed to. The town said it for him in the way towns always did. That particular fusion of sympathy and judgment that managed to be neither. Poor Evelyn. I suppose it was inevitable. He needed someone more settled. As if settled was something Evelyn had chosen not to be. As if the storm and the dishonest merchant and the impossible arithmetic of survival were choices she had made out of some personal preference for instability. She had heard all of it. She had kept getting up. Not because she was fearless. She was not fearless. She was terrified regularly. Specifically, in the 3 in the morning way that left her staring at the ceiling, cataloging every mistake she had ever made in precise and unforgiving detail. She was afraid that the town was right. She was afraid that the voice in her own head, the one that sounded increasingly like the market square, was telling her something true. She was afraid that determination alone was not enough, and that she would spend the rest of her life trying to prove something that couldn't be proven. She had kept getting up anyway, because stopping meant the story ended here, and she was not willing for the story to end here. The morning Thomas knocked her bread onto the ground. She had been running on 4 hours of sleep and coffee she'd made too strong because she'd needed the strength of it. She had arrived at the market at 5:30. She had sold 3 loaves before Thomas even opened his stall. She had been having, by her own modest standards, a reasonable morning. And then he had walked past. Her table walked past it deliberately, taking a route that added 20 feet to his path, from the street to his stall, and his arm had come out and connected with her tray. And the bread had gone into the dirt, and he had turned to his audience and performed his judgment. She had not planned what she said to him afterward. It had come out of somewhere lower and more certain than planning. And when she walked back to her table and straightened her play and felt her heart pounding so hard it was almost audible, she had understood something with sudden clarity. She was past the point where this could get worse. When you have nothing left to lose in terms of reputation, there is a strange kind of freedom in that. The worst had already happened. Thomas had already poisoned the well, already convinced the town to see her as a cautionary tale, already made her name synonymous with failure. He had already done his most damaging work. The only place left to go was forward. She did not know, that morning, how she was going to go forward. She had her small supply of salvaged bread and her ruined loaves, and a market square full of people who had just watched a powerful man humiliate her and done nothing. She had no particular plan. She had, as she always had, only the next hour and the will to get through it. She was standing behind her table, composing herself, when she heard boots on the ground behind her. She turned, expecting another comment, another observation, from someone who had decided that what she needed in this moment was their opinion. It was a man she had never seen before. He was looking at the loaves she had set aside, the ruined ones, the ones she'd left in the dirt when she collected the rest. He crouched down, picked one up, turned it over to Rumble in his hands with the careful attention of someone who actually understood what they were looking at. "Second rise," he said, almost to himself. Then he stood and looked at her. He was lean and weathered, and direct in the particular way of men who spent most of their time outdoors without an audience. Did he do that on purpose, he said. He said it completely without drama. Like a man asking for a weather report. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. He nodded. Looked at Thomas Whitaker's stall across the square. Then back at her display. "How much for everything that's left?" he said. She stared at him. "You just watch that man knock my bread into the dirt." "I saw it," he said. "And you want to buy what's left?" "I want to try what you made," he said simply. What he did has nothing to do with whether it's good. She felt something in her chest, do something she couldn't immediately name. "You don't know if it's good." "I know the technique," he said. "Someone who bothers with a second rise and uses fresh rendered lard. I can tell the difference in the crust from 3 feet away." He looked at her steadily. "I want to taste the rest." She named her price. He paid it without negotiating. "Do you have stew?" he said, looking at the covered pot. "I do. What's in it?" "Beef, onion, turnip, thyme, rosemary, bay leaf." A small amount of whiskey. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent, whiskey. "A small amount," she said. It tightens the flavor. I know, he said, not patronizingly. Just as if that were something a person would know. And he was one of those persons. Can I have that too? She helped him load the pot. He produced a canvas bag she hadn't noticed and carefully packed the remaining bread and both pies, the apple and the rhubarb, with a thoroughness that told her he had handled goods before. He worked efficiently and without commentary. When everything was packed, he stood and looked at her directly. Lucas Bennett, he said. Evelyn Carter, she said. He nodded. Of course he did. Everyone in Red Hollow knew Evelyn Carter. You know what they say about me, she said. It wasn't a question. I know what Thomas Whitaker says about you, he said. That's not the same thing. He picked up the canvas bag. You have good product, Evelyn Carter. Whatever else is going on here, the product is good. He walked away. She watched him go. Across the square, Thomas Whitaker was watching too. She could feel it. She didn't look. She kept her eyes on Lucas Bennett's retreating back. On the easy confidence of a man who had seen something and decided what he thought about it, and was not interested in anyone else's revision. The product is good. She repeated it to herself quietly. Standing behind her empty table, in the summer morning, her display cleared out before noon for the first time in longer than she could remember. The product is good. She had known that. She had known it in the way you know things about yourself that the world keeps insisting aren't true or private. Persistent, exhausted, knowing that you maintain against constant pressure from outside. It was different, somehow, to hear someone else say it. Especially someone who had said it after watching Thomas Whitaker try to unmake her. She thought about that on the walk home. Thought about the way Lucas Bennett had crouched down to examine the ruined loaves before he said a word to her. The way his first question was about the bread and not about what had just happened. The way he had separated the two things completely and absolutely. As if the only thing that mattered about her work was the work itself. She had been waiting 6 years for someone to do that. She hadn't known she was waiting. She told herself not to build anything from a single interaction with a stranger who bought her food. She was very experienced at telling herself that. She walked back to her farmhouse and lit her stove and started a new batch of dough and was asleep by 9 o'clock. Exhausted in the clean way of a person who had gotten through a hard day. She did not expect to see Lucas Bennett again. She was wrong. He came back 4 days later. A Wednesday, not a market day. He rode directly to her farmhouse, which meant someone had told him where it was. Which meant he had asked. Which meant he had thought about coming back before he arrived. He had 2 things with him, a large jar of fresh cream from his dairy cattle, and a straightforward proposal. I have 38 ranch workers, he said, standing in her doorway without being invited in. Because he was a man who understood the difference between arriving and intruding. They eat twice a day, and my current cook is producing food that's technically edible and completely joyless. I want to add a supplemental supply twice a week. Delivered or collected, your choice. I'll provide dairy. Some cuts of beef, vegetables from my cellar. You provide the meals. Fair rate, clear terms, written down. He looked at her. No charity in it. This is business. Why me? She said. He didn't look away. Because you're good. And because you're hungry in the way that makes people better at their work. Not worse. She considered that. You mean desperate. No, he said. I mean hungry. There's a difference. Desperate cuts corners. Hungry works harder. He held out the jar of cream. Your coffee this morning smells like it's 3 days old. Take the cream. She took the cream. When do you want to start? She said. Next week, he said, if you're ready. I'll be ready Monday, she said. He nodded, turned to go, and then stopped. Turned back partway. That was a brave thing you did this morning, he said. What you said to Whitaker. It was stupid, she said. He has more power in this town than I do. Probably, Lucas agreed. But you said it anyway. He looked at her for a moment. I noticed that. Then he left. Evelyn stood in her doorway holding a jar of fresh cream, and the morning air was warm, and her kitchen smelled like new bread, and she thought very carefully and deliberately about not building anything from this. She was already building. She could feel it. The way you feel a structure going up. Not from grand gestures, but from small solid things, placed one on top of another, a stranger who crouched down to look at her bread. A jar of cream delivered without condition. The particular words "you're good," said by a man who did not appear to say things he didn't mean. She closed the door, went back to her kitchen, started planning Monday's menu. The arrangement transformed her operation in ways she had not fully anticipated. The access to quality supply was the obvious change. Lucas's dairy cattle produced milk so rich, it changed the texture of everything she made. Her custards became something people described with closed eyes. Her bread developed a quality that made strangers stop mid-bite and look at what they were eating. The beef cuts he provided were working cuts, the kind with real flavor that needed time and low heat. And Evelyn knew exactly what to do with that. She slow-braised. She rendered. She developed gravies from the things that made ranch workers sit quietly for a moment before they asked for more. The news spread the way news about food always spreads, through hunger. One worker told another. Ranch hands who bought from Lucas's supply told people in adjacent operations. Families who heard from their husbands started appearing at the market on Tuesdays and Saturdays, looking for the woman whose stew the rocking b-boys wouldn't stop talking about. 4 weeks after she started the arrangement with Lucas, Evelyn sold out before noon on a Tuesday. She stood looking at her empty table and felt that same disorienting sensation, the one that was not quite triumph and not quite happiness, but something quieter and more foundational. The feeling of a story shifting. Thomas Whitaker was at his stall. She did not look at him, but she felt him watching. And she felt, standing in that market square with her empty table and her cash box heavier than it had been in years, that Thomas Whitaker was going to be a problem before this was over. She was right about that too. Lucas came to the market that Saturday and brought coffee. 2 cups from the diner across the street. He handed one to her without making a ceremony of it. And they stood in the morning quiet before the market filled up. And she looked at him sideways and thought, I do not know this man yet, but I think I would like to. She did not say that. She said, the short rib sold in 20 minutes. He said, I know. 2 of my men rode back to see if you had any left. I didn't. I know that too. Something moved in his expression. Make more next week. She laughed. It came out without permission. Quick and unguarded, the kind of laugh that belongs to moments when your guard comes down before you notice. She caught herself and looked away, the old reflex. The habit of making yourself smaller so nobody could accuse you of taking up too much space. Lucas was quiet for a moment. You do that, he said. Do what? Pull the laugh back, like you're apologizing for it. She looked at him. He was looking at the market, not at her, which somehow made it easier to hear. Old habit, she said. You should quit it, he said. Not unkindly, just with the plainness of a man who said what he observed and did not dress it up. She looked at her coffee cup. You're very direct. I find it saves time. Most people find it uncomfortable. Most people, he said, haven't built a ranch in the middle of nowhere and tried to run it alone for 8 years. He paused. You get direct or you get lost. She thought about that. How long have you been alone? He was quiet for a moment. Long enough that she thought she'd gone too far. My wife, Clara, passed in 1884, he said. 4 years, the ranch keeps me occupied. The work keeps the days moving. He held his coffee cup in both hands. But occupied and full are different things. She said nothing. Let it breathe. She would have liked your food, he said. Clara. She had opinions about cooking. Strong opinions. She would have argued with you about the whiskey in the stew. And who would have won? The thing that moved across his face, then she would think about it later. At home, turning it over carefully. It was grief, yes. But grief that had been lived with long enough to make room for other things. Like warmth. Like something almost like possibility. She would have, he said. Clara always won. Evelyn smiled. I would have liked her, she said. He looked at her then. Directly. Yes, he said, with a certainty that surprised her. You would have. They stood in the morning for another few minutes, finishing their coffee, while the market filled up around them. She watched families arrive, watched Thomas Whitaker's boys set up his prominent stall near the center, watched the town arrange itself into its daily shape. Lucas said, "Whitaker's watching us. He's been watching since you first came to my table," she said. "I'm his problem. You're his competition," Lucas corrected. "There's a difference. Not in his mind." "No," Lucas agreed. "Not in his mind. He finished his coffee. He's going to do something. Men like that always do something when they feel their position threatened." "I know," she said. "Are you ready for it?" She looked at the empty spaces on her table where yesterday's bread had been. She looked at her cash box, solid and real. She looked at her own hands, capable, experienced, scarred in small ways from years of kitchen work. "I've been ready for it for 6 years," she said. "I've been surviving his version of something for 6 years." She looked at Lucas. "The difference now is I have something worth protecting." He looked at her steadily. That direct, honest look that she had learned, in these few short weeks, to read as its own kind of language. "Yes," he said quietly. "You do." He left. An hour later, after buying 3 loaves of bread that she suspected were going directly to his ranch workers, even though he could have arranged that through their regular delivery, he tied his horse with that same single efficient knot and rode out of town without looking back. Evelyn watched him go. Across the square, Thomas Whitaker watched both of them with the expression of a man who had just decided something. She felt it. She picked up her empty coffee cup and held it in both hands, still warm from where his hands had been, and she thought, "Whatever is coming, I am still here, and I am not leaving." The summer deepened around Red Hollow like a long, slow breath. Evelyn Carter was still standing, and, somewhere in the back of her chest, in a place she had locked very carefully for a very long time, something was beginning, against all reasonable odds and past all sensible warnings, to open. The rumors started on a Monday. Evelyn didn't hear them directly, she never did. At first, they came to her the way cold air comes through a crack in a wall. Indirectly, gradually, until you realize the whole room has gotten colder, and you can't remember exactly when it happened. Mrs. Abernathy was the one who finally said it to her face, appearing at the farmhouse door on a Tuesday morning with the particular energy of a woman who has been building something in for longer than was comfortable. "I thought you should know," Mrs. Abernathy said, stepping inside without being invited, which told Evelyn how serious she considered the information. "People are talking about you and Lucas Bennett." Evelyn was in the middle of scoring the tops of 6 loaves. She kept going. "People have always talked about me. This is different, Mrs." Abernathy sat down at the kitchen table without asking. "Thomas Whitaker is telling people that the only reason your business is recovering is because you made some kind of arrangement with Lucas. And not just a business arrangement." She paused meaningfully. "He's implying something else entirely." Evelyn's knife stopped. Just for a moment. Then she kept moving. "He's implying," she said carefully, "that I traded something other than food for Lucas Bennett's support." Mrs. Abernathy's silence was confirmation enough. Evelyn set down her knife. She turned around and looked at the older woman sitting at her table, and she felt a specific kind of rage, not hot, not explosive, but cold and clarifying, the kind that makes you see everything with uncomfortable precision. "He knocked my bread into the dirt in front of 50 people, she said. "And now, because the work is finally going somewhere, he's doing this. He's scared," Mrs. Abernathy said simply. "He hasn't been scared of anyone in this town in 10 years. "Good," Evelyn said. She turned back to her bread. "He should be scared of what good work looks like when it finally has room to breathe." Mrs. Abernathy left 20 minutes later. Evelyn stood at her counter after the door closed and pressed both hands flat against the wood and breathed. She counted out what she knew. She had her arrangement with Lucas, documented clearly, terms written and signed by both of them. Lucas had insisted on that, which she had appreciated without fully understanding until now. She had her records, every purchase, every delivery. Every payment made and received. She had done nothing wrong, and nothing shameful, and nothing that required defense. What she had was Thomas Whitaker using the one weapon he had left. Because the business weapon wasn't working anymore. She picked up her knife and went back to scoring the bread. She told Lucas that afternoon, when he stopped by to drop off a quarter of fresh beef and stayed, as he sometimes did, for 10 minutes, of the kind of conversation that had gradually stopped feeling like a business check-in and started feeling like something she looked forward to in a way she was trying not to examine too closely. She told him plainly, without softening it. She had learned, in the weeks of knowing him, that Lucas Bennett did not want things softened. He wanted them accurate. He listened, without interrupting. He was leaning against her kitchen doorframe in the way he had. Comfortable in his own body, in a way that took up no more space than necessary. And he listened to all of it, with his arms crossed, and his eyes steady, and his expression revealing nothing except attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Keep working. Let the work answer." He looked at her with something she was beginning to recognize, a particular quality of regard that she would have called respect in anyone else, but in Lucas felt more specific than that. More considered. Like something he had decided rather than something automatic. "That's the right call," he said. "I know," she said. "It doesn't make it easier." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." He was quiet again. "Then he came to see me." She went still. "When?" "Yesterday." "At the ranch." Lucas uncrossed his arms. He was very polite about it. Very concerned. He said he'd heard I was getting involved in a complicated situation, and he wanted to make sure I had the full picture. "The full picture," Evelyn repeated. "He told me about the failed bakery, the debt to Gerald Pierce, your engagement falling apart." He said it without any particular emphasis. Just facts being reported. He presented it as doing me a favor. As looking out for my interests. Evelyn's chest was tight. And Lucas looked at her. "I told him I was aware of your history and had formed my own opinion. Then I told him to get off my property." Something moved in her throat. She swallowed it down. "You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't." He picked up the hat he'd set on her counter. "But he was wasting my time, and I don't have patience for men who dress up interference as concern." He moved toward the door. "The arrangement stands, Evelyn. Nothing he says changes what I know about your work." He was at the door when she said it. She didn't plan to. It came from the same place the words to Thomas Whitaker had come from, somewhere below planning. Somewhere where she was more honest than careful. "Lucas, why are you doing this? And I don't mean the business arrangement. I know what that is. I mean, why did you come back? After the first day, why did you keep coming back?" He stopped. He turned around slowly and looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked not uncomfortable, exactly, but like a man who was taking a question seriously enough to actually answer it, rather than deflect it. "Because I recognize something," he said finally. "What?" "Someone who gets up every morning and does the work anyway." He looked at her steadily. "I've done that for 4 years, after Clara died. You get up, and you do the work, and you don't let anyone see how much it cost you, because the moment you show that it cost you, they start deciding whether you can handle it." He paused. "I saw you do that, on that first day in the market. I saw what it was, and I recognized it." He put his hat on. "That's why." She didn't have a response to that. Nothing she could have said would have been adequate. So she said nothing. She just looked at him, and he looked at her, and something in the room was different than it had been 30 seconds ago. He left. She stood in her kitchen for a long time. Then she started planning the week's deliveries, because that was the only honest response she knew to anything overwhelming. Put your hands to work and let the rest settle on its own. The next Tuesday, 3 new customers came to her market table. One of them was Margaret Holloway. Evelyn didn't realize who she was at first. She was aware of Margaret Holloway, the way you are aware of weather in a distant county. You know it exists. You know it has affected your life in significant ways. But you haven't had occasion to encounter it directly. Margaret was a handsome woman, a few years younger than Evelyn, dressed in the kind of careful prosperity that announced itself without trying. She approached Evelyn's table with a composed expression and looked at the display with genuine assessment. "The rhubarb pie," she said. "Is it properly tart?" Evelyn said. "Balanced with brown sugar and orange peel. I'll take it." Margaret produced her money precisely. As Evelyn wrapped the pie, Margaret said in the tone of someone delivering information they consider neutral but are quite aware is not. "I heard your business is doing well." "Improving," Evelyn said. "Good," Margaret said, and then, after a pause that was exactly one beat too long, "Daniel always said you were talented in the kitchen." Evelyn looked at her. Margaret looked back. Her expression was not unkind. Exactly. It was the expression of a woman who had gotten the thing she wanted and found it somewhat less satisfying than anticipated, and had decided to locate some version of generosity in herself because it cost her very little now. "Thank you for the pie," Margaret said. She took it and walked away. Evelyn watched her go. She thought, "You won the man who left me. And now you are buying my pie." There was something in that which felt like the world demonstrating its sense of humor in a way that required either laughter or tears. And Evelyn chose the former, quietly, to herself, turning away so that the people passing her table couldn't see her smiling at nothing. She was still smiling when she heard the voice behind her. "She came to your table," Lucas said. She turned. He was there. Saturday had arrived, without her quite noticing the week passing holding 2 coffees. Watching Margaret Holloway's retreating back, with the expression of a man who has just encountered a data point he is sorting into its appropriate category. "She bought the rhubarb pie," Evelyn said. Lucas was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel about that?" It was such a direct question, asked so plainly that she almost didn't know what to do with it. People didn't usually ask her how she felt about things. They told her how she should feel, or they assumed they knew, or they treated her feelings as beside the point. Lucas just asked. "Honestly," she said, "I feel like the best revenge is a good rhubarb pie." He looked at her. And then Lucas Bennett, who she had never once, in all these weeks, seen laugh fully, who expressed warmth in the particular understated way of a man who had forgotten how to be demonstrative, laughed. Not politely, not briefly, a real laugh, the kind that changes a person's face. That shows you something they usually keep behind all the stillness and the steadiness. It lasted only a few seconds. Then he caught himself and straightened. And she could see him pulling the composure back over himself, the same way she pulled the laugh back. And she thought, "There it is. We do the same thing." "You should quit that," she said, throwing his words back at him. He looked at her sharply, then understood. And something moved in his expression, something that was awareness and recognition, and possibly something else. Something that neither of them was prepared to name in a market square on a Saturday morning with Thomas Whitaker's boys watching from across the way. "Fair," he said quietly. They drank their coffee. The trouble came from a direction she hadn't predicted. She had been preparing for Thomas for whatever formal action he might decide to take, whatever new story he might construct, whatever lever he could pull in his capacity as the town's most commercially powerful figure. She had her records. She had her arrangement with Lucas, documented and clean. She had been preparing for Thomas to come at her the way he always had publicly. Socially, through reputation and implication, she had not been preparing for Nora Hatch. Nora was 26 years old and had worked at Evelyn's kitchen table 3 mornings a week for the past month, helping with prep work in exchange for a small wage. She was quick with her hands and pleasant in her manner, and Evelyn had been genuinely glad to have her. They had built, not quite a friendship, but a warmth, a working without respect. So when she appeared at her door on a Wednesday morning and stood in the entrance with her hands twisting together and her eyes doing the thing that eyes do when a person has something to say that they would rather not say, Evelyn felt a very specific premonition. "Sit down." "Nora," she said. Nora sat, looked at her hands, then looked up. "Mr. Whitaker offered me a job," she said, "at his store. More hours than I'm getting here. and a guaranteed rate even in slow weeks. She paused. He said, "If I came to work for him, I should." He said he needed someone who could let him know how things were going. "Here." Evelyn was very still. "He wants you to report back to him." Nora's face confirmed it before she spoke. He made it sound like he was just concerned. About the operation. About whether it was stable. "What he wants," Evelyn said carefully, "is information he can use. He wants to know when my supply comes, what I charge, what my arrangement with Lucas Bennett looks like from the inside." She looked at Nora. "That's what he offered you more money for." Nora's jaw was tight. "I know what it was," she said. I'm not going to do it." She looked up, something determined moving through her discomfort. "I wanted to tell you." "Because you had a right to know?" he asked. Evelyn sat back in her chair and looked at this young woman across the table. She felt for a moment the specific weight of being the person others had to deliver bad news to the position of someone who had been a target long enough that people came to warn her as a matter of course. She wasn't sure whether to feel protected or tired. She chose to feel grateful. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me and for not doing it." Nora nodded. There was a pause. You're still here if you want to be," Evelyn said. "As long as you want." The relief on Nora's was complete and unguarded, and Evelyn made herself a note the way she occasionally made herself notes about her recipes, when she understood something new, that loyalty, when it came from a place of genuine choice, felt entirely different from the kind extracted by dependence. She told Lucas on Saturday. His expression, which was generally so controlled, did something interesting when she described Thomas's offer to Nora. A tightening, brief and quickly contained, around his jaw. "He's escalating," he said. "Yes." He went from rumors to active interference. He looked at her. He wouldn't do that unless he was genuinely worried. "I know," she said. "Which means the work is doing what I hoped." Lucas looked at her for a moment. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, something beyond respect, beyond recognition, something that was assessing her not for her capabilities, which he had never doubted, but for something else. Something interior. "You're not rattled," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm rattled," she said honestly. "I'm rattled every morning when I get up and wonder what he's planning next. I'm rattled every time I hear a new version of whatever story he's telling." She looked at her coffee. "But being rattled and being stopped are different things. I stopped letting them be the same thing a long time ago." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I show you something?" She looked up. "At the ranch," he said. "I want to show you something. Can you come Wednesday?" She didn't ask what it was. She looked at him and calculated, not the business calculation, not the practical arithmetic of whether she had time in her week, but the other kind, the kind that involved trust and what it meant to agree to something without knowing the full terms. "Yes," she said. Wednesday morning she rode out to the Rocking Bee for the first time. She had imagined Lucas Bennett's ranch many times in the past months, had constructed it from the details he let fall in conversation. The quality of his supplies, the things his workers said when they picked up deliveries. She had imagined something functional and orderly, which was correct. What she hadn't imagined was the particular quality of silence in the main house. She felt it when she stepped through the door. Not an uncomfortable silence. Not an ominous one. Just the silence of a space that had once been full and wasn't anymore. Like a room still remembering furniture that had been moved. Lucas watched her take it in without saying anything. Then he led her through to the kitchen. It was an extraordinary kitchen. Large, well-equipped, built clearly by someone who had understood what a good kitchen required. And completely unused in any serious way. The surfaces were clean but bare. The oven was cold. "Clara built this kitchen," he said. He said it the way he always said her name, directly, without flinching, but also without the ease of something that didn't cost him. She spent 3 months designing it. She knew what she needed. He looked at the space. "After she passed, I had no use for most of it. My cook operates out of the smaller prep kitchen near the bunkhouse." He paused. "I've been thinking." She waited. Your farmhouse kitchen is good, he said, but it's not big enough for what your business is becoming. You're already working past what the space can support. He looked at her. I'd like to offer you use of this kitchen. Formal arrangement. Fair terms. You'd have access to the equipment, the cold storage, the space. In exchange, my workers eat better than they do now. And you have room to grow. He paused once more. It's not charity. It makes practical sense for both of us. She stood in Clara's kitchen and looked at the equipment and the space and the cold storage, and she understood that he was offering her something that went beyond practical sense. He was offering her access to the thing he'd kept most, the part of his life that had been Clara's, the part that had been silent for 4 years. She understood what it cost him. Lucas, she said. It's a practical arrangement, he said again. Slightly more firmly. It's more than that, she said. He looked at her. Didn't deny it, didn't confirm it, just held her gaze with the steadiness that was, she had realized over these months. Not the absence of feeling, but its most disciplined form. Is that a problem, he said? No, she said quietly. It's not a problem. Then will you use the kitchen? She looked around once more at the clean surfaces, and the cold oven, and the particular quality of silence that still somehow felt like it was waiting for something, rather than grieving for it. Like a room that had kept the faith. Yes, she said. I'll use the kitchen. Something shifted in his face, not dramatically. Not in any way another person standing farther away would have noticed. Just a small, specific settling. The way a person looks when they have been holding something carefully for a long time and have finally found somewhere safe to set it down. He showed her the storage rooms. He showed her the cold house and the pantry and the delivery access at the back of the property. He was professional and thorough and practical about all of it. And she matched his register perfectly, asking practical questions and making practical assessments. And neither of them mentioned the moment that had passed between them in the kitchen. But it was there. She carried it with her as she learned the space. She was on her way back through the main house when she stopped in the front room. There was a photograph on the mantel. A woman, maybe 30 years old in the photograph, with a direct gaze and a set to her jaw that Evelyn recognized immediately as the expression of someone who said what they meant and didn't much mind whether you were ready for it. She looked at the photograph for a moment. Clara, she said. Not a question. Lucas had come up behind her, close enough that she was aware of him, not quite at her shoulder. She has an honest face, Evelyn said. He was quiet for a moment. She was the most honest person I knew. Evelyn looked at the photograph a moment longer. She felt something complicated, not jealousy, exactly. Something more like the particular tenderness you feel when you understand what someone lost, when you can almost see the shape of the absence they've been living inside. I think, she said carefully, that I would have liked to know her. I think, Lucas said. And his voice was low and close and more unguarded than she had ever heard it. That she would have had very strong opinions about your bread. Evelyn turned to look at him. He was closer than she'd registered. Close enough to see that the steadiness she had attributed to him from the beginning was not, in fact, effortless. It was maintained. Carefully. Consistently maintained. The way you maintain something that matters precisely because you understand what happens when it's lost. Something passed between them. Not words, not an action. Just a recognition, mutual and clear, of what was present and what it was. Then Lucas stepped back, looked at the middle distance. I'll have my men set up access for you by Friday, he said. Thank you, she said. She rode back to her farmhouse in the afternoon light, thinking about practical arrangements and honest faces and the particular courage it took to open a room that had been closed for 4 years. And she pressed one hand against her sternum, briefly as she rode. The old gesture, the one she used when something was too large to hold any other way. She was not going to be foolish about this. She was also, very clearly, already too late to avoid caring. The town noticed she was using the Rocking Bee kitchen almost immediately. Of course it did. 3 mornings a week, Evelyn's wagon was seen turning onto the Rocking Bee road. Sometimes she arrived before dawn, Sometimes she was there past noon. The ranch hands saw her, talked to their families, and the families talked to the town, and the town brought all of this information to Thomas Whitaker with the particular eagerness of people who sense that things are building toward something. Thomas built quickly with what he received. She's living out there. Practically, Evelyn overheard in the dry goods store, in the particular carrying voice of a woman who intended to be overheard. It's not decent, a woman alone, going to a widower's property like that. She kept walking. She did not slow her step. At home, she sat at her kitchen table for 10 minutes and was angry. Completely and specifically, without doing anything about it. She had learned that anger required its 10 minutes, the same way dough required its second rise. You gave it the time, and then you shaped it into something useful. Then she got up and wrote down 3 new recipes which she'd been developing and went to bed at a reasonable hour. The following Tuesday, she arrived at the market to find that 3 of her usual customers weren't there. Not buying from other stalls, just not there, gone. She kept track without making it visible that she was tracking. Counted the faces, calculated the loss. She sold out by 1 o'clock anyway. Because the new customers Lucas's operation had brought her more than covered the defection. But she counted. After the market closed, she was loading her empty wagon when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Cal Brantley, the man who had made the comment on that first terrible Tuesday. Thomas's man at the feed store, standing with his hands in his pockets and an expression that was performing discomfort in a way that looked rehearsed. "Evelyn," he said, "I want to apologize what I said. Months ago. That wasn't right." She looked at him. Took a moment to evaluate. "Why now?" she said. He looked away. Looked back. "Because it wasn't right then either, and I knew it." He paused. "And because whatever Thomas is doing, whatever he's planning, I don't want to be part of it." She was very still. "What is he planning?" Cal's jaw worked. "He's been going through old records." "Your old records? From when you were operating before?" He found something. About some payments you made. Early on. He says there are inconsistencies." Her heart gave a hard single thud. "There are no inconsistencies." He says there are. Cal looked at her with something that was almost apology. "He's going to bring it to the town council. He's been talking to Alderman Dodd for 2 weeks. He's building a case that you're financially irresponsible, that you shouldn't be allowed to expand operations." That he stopped. "I don't know what he wants exactly. But I know he's been putting it together for a while." Evelyn loaded the last crate into her wagon. She did it carefully and completely, because she needed to do something with her hands, and because she refused to let her body show what this information was doing to her insides. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "What are you going to do?" Cal said. She climbed up onto the wagon, picked up the reins. "What I always do," she said. She rode directly to the rocking bee. Lucas was in the yard when she arrived, coming in from the eastern pasture with 2 of his men. He saw her face from 50 yards away and said something to his men and covered the distance between them in the particular way of someone who has recalibrated their pace without making it obvious. "What happened?" he said. She told him. All of it. Cal Brantley, the old records, Alderman Dodd, the town council. She told him in the same level voice she used to tell him everything. Because by now she understood that falling apart in front of Lucas Bennett was not dangerous. But she also understood that what she needed from him right now was not comfort. It was thinking. He listened. His face did the careful, controlled thing it did when he was working through something. "Your old records," he said. "From before. Do you have them?" "All of them," she said. "Every payment, every purchase, every transaction from the day I opened. Including the debt to Gerald Pierce?" "Including that." She looked at him. The payments were real. The debt was real. The overcharge was real. None of it was hidden. None of it was falsified. It's all exactly what it looks like, a woman who got overcharged in a desperate situation and paid back every penny. He nodded slowly. "Bring me the records." "Lucas, I'm not going to fight your fight," he said. His voice was clear and direct. I want to read what he has access to so I understand what he's distorting. There's a difference. She held his gaze. All right, she said. She brought the records the next morning. They sat across from each other at the rocking bee kitchen table, her table now, in the way that spaces gradually become yours, when you fill them with your work, and went through everything. Lucas read carefully. He asked questions that told her he understood business finances, that he was looking for the exact seam Thomas would try to split. He found it. Here, he said. He turned a page toward her. This entry, December 1883. It reads as an outgoing payment to a G. Pierce for supply restock. But there's no corresponding receipt number. Evelyn looked. Her heart sank. The receipt burned, she said. In the stove fire. The following January. I had it. I just don't have it anymore. He looked at her. You remember what it was for? I remember everything, she said. 50 pounds of flour, 20 of sugar, 10 of lard, 12 jars of preserves. Gerald Pierce, 3rd day of December 1883. Paid in full. She could recite it the way she could recite a recipe. I just can't prove it. Lucas was quiet for a moment. Thomas doesn't know the receipt is gone, he said slowly. He just knows there's no number in your records. He's going to tell the council. That means you fabricated the expense. He sat back. Which means you didn't hide the money. You spent it legitimately. But without the receipt, you can't demonstrate that. No, she said. He looked at her steadily. Gerald Pierce is still in this county. He is. Would he confirm the transaction? She almost laughed. Gerald Pierce is the man who overcharged me 40% and slept well that night. He's not going to confirm anything that doesn't benefit him. Lucas said. He will, if the alternative is explaining his pricing practices to every rancher and merchant in the county. She looked at him. He looked back. There was something in his expression that was beyond steadiness now. Something with an edge to it. Not unkind, but absolutely certain. The look of a man who has decided what the right move is and has no hesitation about making it. Let me talk to Gerald Pierce, he said. She was quiet for a moment. You'd do that. It's a conversation, he said. I have facts. He has incentives. That's just arithmetic. It's more than arithmetic, she said. He's not your problem. He was never your problem. Lucas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. Something he said quietly, without particular emphasis, but which landed with the weight of something he had been carrying for a while and had decided to set down. You became my concern when I chose to stand beside you, he said. That happened before either of us was ready to name it. But it happened. And I don't walk away from what I've chosen. The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at the man across the table from her, the steady hands, and the weathered face, and the 4 years of careful grief and the ranch that was too large for one person to fill alone, and she understood something with a clarity that felt like cold water after a long thirst. This was not a business arrangement anymore. It had not been one for a long time. And whatever was building in the space between them, slow and real and honest, the way only things between careful people build, this was stronger than Thomas Whitaker's rumors, and Gerald Pierce's arithmetic, and the town council's judgment combined. All right, she said. Talk to Gerald Pierce. Lucas nodded once. The way he confirmed decisions. He reached across the table and briefly, so briefly it was almost technical, covered her hand with his. Then he picked up the records. I'll go tomorrow morning, he said. Outside the window, the summer was beginning to turn. The light had the quality of late season, in it still warm, but with a weight underneath, the kind of light that knows what's coming. The town of Red Hollow was setting itself for something. Thomas Whitaker was building toward something, and inside this kitchen, that smelled like bread and new beginnings, 2 careful, independent, deeply stubborn people were building something of their own. Neither of them said it. They didn't need to. The building was already underway. Gerald Pierce agreed to meet on a Thursday. Evelyn knew this because Lucas told her. And the way he told her briefly, without elaboration. with a particular economy of a man who has handled a difficult thing and considered it handled, told her that the meeting with Gerald Pierce had not been a pleasant conversation for Gerald Pierce. He'll confirm the transaction, Lucas said. He was at her kitchen table, both hands around a cup of coffee, his posture carrying the slight stiffness of someone who has spent a morning doing something they found distasteful. He'll provide a written statement for the council if it comes to that. Evelyn looked at him. What did you say to him? Lucas looked at his coffee. I explained that I purchased supplies for a 38-head operation and that I have considerable influence over where ranchers in this county choose to spend their money. I also explained that if his business practiced with vulnerable customers during one of 1,883 became common knowledge, he might find that influence working against him rather than for him. He paused. He was very cooperative. You didn't threaten him, Evelyn said carefully. I described a situation, Lucas said. He drew his own conclusions. She looked at him for a long moment. She was trying to decide how she felt about this, whether the means sat right with her, whether accepting help that came wrapped in leverage was something she could hold cleanly. She had spent 6 years being entirely her own instrument. She had never had anyone fight adjacent to her before. Thank you, she said finally. Don't thank me yet, I said. Pierce's statement covers the missing receipt. It doesn't cover what Thomas is going to do with everything else. What else is there? That's what I don't know. His jaw was set in the way she had learned, meant he was worried, but was managing it. Thomas has been talking to Alderman Dodd for 2 weeks. That's not a short conversation about one missing receipt. He's building something larger. The hearing date arrived 11 days later. Posted on the notice board outside the town hall in the particular formal language that small municipalities used when they wanted something to sound inevitable. A review of business licensing and commercial conduct, requested by concerned citizens to be heard before the full council on the 14th of August. Evelyn read the notice twice. Then she took it down, folded it, put it in her apron pocket, and went back to work. She told herself the work would calm her. It usually did. She mixed 3 batches of dough that morning, started a braise, put up 2 dozen jars of preserved tomatoes from the Rocking Bee's kitchen garden that she had taken on managing in the last few weeks because nobody else was using them and it seemed wasteful. She worked for 4 hours without stopping, and at the end of it her hands were capable, and her kitchen smelled like everything she had built, and she was still terrified. Not of losing. She had lost before and survived it. She was terrified of losing in public, of standing in front of the Red Hollow Town Council and hearing Thomas Whitaker describe her, systematically and officially, as everything the town had always quietly believed she was. Of having it made formal, permanent, recorded. She was terrified of becoming the story everyone already knew, just with a council seal on it. Nora found her sitting still at her kitchen table at 2 in the afternoon, which had never happened before. In the weeks Nora had worked for her, Evelyn had never once sat still during working hours. Nora set down the preserving jars she'd been carrying and looked at her employer with the careful attention of a young woman who had grown up watching her mother navigate hard things. Tell me, Nora said. Evelyn told her, the council hearing, the timeline, what Thomas had been building. Nora was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then, what do you need? I need every record I have organized chronologically and cross-referenced by transaction, Evelyn said. I need Gerald Pierce's written statement, copied in triplicate. I need my current account books, showing the last 8 months of operation. And I need a clear summary of my arrangement with Lucas Bennett that any alderman in that room can understand in 10 minutes. Nora had already picked up a pencil. I'll start tonight. Something in Evelyn's chest loosened slightly. Not much. But Nora. Don't thank me, Nora said, with a firmness that reminded Evelyn suddenly, sharply, of herself at 26. Just tell me where the older records are stored. They worked until midnight. Lucas came the next morning and found them both still at the table, surrounded by organized stacks of paper. Evelyn's handwriting clear and methodical across pages of summary. Nora's additions filling the gaps. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking this in. "You started without me," he said. "You would have done the same," Evelyn said without looking up. He came in, sat down, picked up the nearest stack of records. He read carefully and in silence for the better part of an hour while Evelyn and Nora continued working around him. 3 times he asked a question. 3 times she answered it. He made 2 notes in the margin of his own paper and set it aside. "This is solid," he said finally. "It's honest," she said. "Which should be the same thing." "Should be," he said. And the way he said it quietly, with a specific weight, told her he was thinking about the gap between what should be and what was, and what that gap might mean in a room full of men who owed Thomas Whitaker favors. She thought about it too. She thought about it for 11 days. On the morning of the 14th, she woke before 4. She lay in her bed for approximately 3 minutes, looking at the ceiling, cataloging what she felt. Fear, yes. Anger. Still that cold, clear anger that had been her companion since Thomas knocked her bread into the dirt. Something else, something she identified, with some surprise, as a kind of readiness. Not confidence, not certainty. Just the readiness of someone who has done everything they know how to do and has arrived at the place where the only remaining action is to stand. She got up. She dressed carefully her best dress. The one she kept for occasions, dark blue with simple lines. Because she understood that how you presented yourself in a room was part of your argument before you opened your mouth. She braided her hair. She made coffee. She drank it standing at her counter because sitting felt too much like waiting. Lucas arrived at 7. He looked at her when she opened the door. He took in the dress, the careful hair, the composed face, and said nothing about any of it. He handed her the coffee he'd brought from the diner and said, "Ready?" "Yes," she said. They rode to town together, not speaking much. The silence between them had long since passed, the point being uncomfortable. It had become the kind of silence that belongs to people who have learned each other's rhythms, who don't require noise to confirm presence. She was aware of him beside her in the particular way she had become aware of him generally. Not constantly, not obsessively, but reliably. The way you are aware of something that has become part of the structure of your days. The town hall was already populated when they arrived. Red Hollow had turned this into the event Cal Brantley had predicted. People who had no direct stake in the outcome but had a considerable appetite for it, filling the back rows with the studied casualness of people pretending they had simply happened to be there. She saw Mrs. Abernathy in the 3rd row, who caught her eye and gave a small tight nod that said, "I am here and I know what this is." She saw 2 of Lucas's ranch workers near the wall, which surprised her until she registered that they were there intentionally, that Lucas had said something to them, that they had chosen to come. She saw Thomas Whitaker at the front, seated beside Alderman Dodd, talking with the low-voiced ease of a man who considers the result already determined. She saw him register her entrance. She saw him register Lucas Bennett walking in beside her. Something crossed his face quickly, almost invisibly. But she caught it. He had not expected Lucas to come. He had constructed this hearing around the image of Evelyn Carter standing alone, which was the image that had always served his narrative best. Evelyn alone was manageable. Evelyn alone was the woman everyone already knew how to see. Evelyn, with Lucas Bennett beside her, was a different picture. She filed that away and took her seat at the respondents' table. The council was 5 men, seated in a line with the particular gravity of people who have been given a small amount of formal power and intend to make full use of it. Chairman Alderman Horace Webb, 63, who had known Evelyn's father and had never quite decided what he thought of Evelyn herself. James Calloway, who was Mrs. Abernathy's brother-in-law, and whom Evelyn had always found fair if cautious. 3 others she knew less well, 2 of whom she had seen in conversation with Thomas over the past months. She noted the math. She was probably starting at 2 to 3 against her. Possibly 2 to 3, depending on Calloway. Thomas opened his case with the polished ease of a man who had prepared this presentation and enjoyed giving it. He was measured, concerned-sounding, and thorough. He had organized the discrepancies in her old records into a clean visual sequence. She had to give him credit for that. The man knew how to construct a document that looked damning and walked the counsel through each one with the patience of someone explaining something obvious to people he trusted to be reasonable. The missing receipt from December 1883 was his centerpiece. Without the receipt number, the payment to Gerald Pierce looked, as he framed it, like an invented expense, money unaccounted for. A pattern, he suggested gently, of financial decisions that were less than transparent. He didn't use the word fraud. He didn't need to. He let the counsel's imagination do that work. He was good at this. She had always known he was good at this. She sat and listened and kept her face neutral and her hands folded on the table and let him finish completely before she moved. When Chairman Webb turned to her, she stood. She had prepared a speech. She did not give it. Instead, she said, "Before I respond to anything Alderman Whitaker has presented, I'd like to call a witness. Gerald Pierce is in this room. I'd ask that he be heard." Thomas's head turned. She watched it happen, the quick, controlled movement of a man recalculating. He hadn't known about Gerald Pierce. He had built his entire case around that missing receipt. Had spent 2 weeks preparing the counsel to see it as the cornerstone of her alleged irresponsibility. He had not known, until this moment, that the cornerstone had been removed. Gerald Pierce was not a comfortable man in public. He was a man who preferred to conduct his business in the one-on-one spaces where information asymmetry worked in his favor. He sat in the second row with his hat in his hands and his color slightly elevated and the expression of a man who had agreed to something and was only now fully reckoning with what it would feel like to follow through. He followed through. He confirmed the transaction. December 3rd, 1883. 50 pounds of flour, 20 of sugar, 10 of lard, 12 jars of preserves, paid in full. He had the original receipt in his records. He produced a copy, which he handed to Chairman Webb with hands that were steady enough. He did not mention the overcharge. Evelyn had not asked him to. The room absorbed this. Thomas absorbed it. He was very still, in the way of a man who has taken a blow and is deciding in real time how to respond. Then he leaned toward Alderman Dodd and said something quiet and quick. And Dodd cleared his throat and said, "This addresses one entry. There remain other concerns about the overall pattern of Miss Carter's financial management. The council would like to hear her account of the debt incurred during the winter of 1883 and how it affected her subsequent operations." So Thomas had a backup. Of course he did. She had expected this. She opened her records. She walked the council through everything. Not defensively, that was the crucial decision she had made in the 11 days of preparation. The thing she and Lucas had talked about at the kitchen table at midnight. The strategic choice that she believed was also simply the right one. Not defensively, but completely. She showed them the storm. She showed them the timing of the supply shortage. She showed them the debt to Gerald Pierce and the repayment schedule she had constructed alone, without any assistance and honored down to the last dollar. She showed them every mistake she had made and the evidence that she had learned from each one. She stood in front of the Red Hollow Town Council and did not pretend she had been perfect. She showed them she had been honest. Halfway through her presentation, Alderman Calloway leaned forward. "Miss Carter," he said, "your current operation, the one you've been running for the past 8 months. You say it's profitable?" "Yes," she said. "Consistently?" "Consistently since the 3rd week." She turned to the relevant section of her current accounts. "I have 8 months of records showing increasing income, stable supply costs, and no outstanding debts of any kind." She passed the document to Webb, who passed it down the line. "I am not asking the council to overlook my past difficulties. I am asking you to weigh them against what I have built since." Calloway sat back. He exchanged a brief look with Webb. Thomas was on his feet again. Chairman, the question before this council is not whether Miss Carter has had some recent success. The question is whether her pattern of financial decision-making warrants an expansion of her commercial operations. A merchant who I concealed nothing, Evelyn said. The room went quiet. She had not planned to interrupt him, but she also did not regret it. I did not conceal one single thing, she said. Every difficulty I experienced is documented in the records I have provided this council. I documented a storm that cost me my stores. I documented a debt I incurred and repaid. I documented every transaction in 6 years of operation, including the ones that went wrong. She looked at Thomas directly. The man across this room from me has presented a case built on the absence of a single receipt that I have now provided through a witness. He has called my financial management irresponsible while presenting no evidence of actual wrongdoing. He has built this hearing on the word irresponsible because it sounds like fraud without requiring proof of it. She turned back to the council. I think this council deserves to ask why Thomas Whitaker, the town's most prominent merchant, has invested 2 weeks of preparation in preventing a competing food operation from expanding. I think that question is relevant to what you are hearing today. The room was very quiet. Thomas stood. Chairman, this is an attempt to deflect down. Thomas. Chairman Webb said it with the quiet authority of a man who has just decided something. He did not say it unkindly. He said it with the finality of a door closing. Thomas sat. Webb looked at Evelyn's records. He looked at Gerald Pierce's written statement. He looked at the 8 months of clean accounts. He was quiet for a moment. Then Lucas stood up. He had not been called. He was not a witness. He was sitting in the row directly behind Evelyn, and he stood up from that seat with the unhurried certainty of a man who has decided that a thing needs to be said and has decided to say it. Mr. Bennett Webb said, "You are not part of this proceeding." "No, sir," Lucas said. "I'd like to speak as a member of this community, if the council will allow it." 2 minutes. Webb looked at him. Lucas Bennett was not a man you denied 2 minutes easily in this county. Webb nodded. Lucas looked at the council. He did not look at Evelyn. He spoke directly to the 5 men in front of him. And he spoke in the voice he used when he meant every syllable. "I have been a rancher in this county for 12 years, he said. "I have operated a profitable business through drought and bad winters and market fluctuations that would have finished lesser operations. I know what financial management looks like. I know what a balance sheet means and what a debt pattern means and what recovery looks like from the inside." He paused. "I have reviewed Evelyn Carter's records personally. What they show is not irresponsibility. They show a woman who encountered circumstances that would have ended most operations, who documented every difficulty honestly, who paid back every cent she owed, and who rebuilt from nothing with no assistance from any person in this room." He looked briefly at Thomas. "They also show that the only legitimate concern raised in this hearing, the missing receipt, was addressed today with a witness and documentation." He turned back to Webb. "I am not here to speak for Evelyn Carter. She does not require that. I am here because this council is about to make a decision based on a presentation designed to confuse difficulty with dishonesty. And I think that distinction matters." He sat down. The room was so quiet Evelyn could hear her own pulse. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the council, and she kept her hands folded, and she sat very still. And inside her chest, something was happening that she had no immediate words for, something about being seen, about being stood beside, about what it meant when someone chose, publicly and without hesitation, to align themselves with your version of the truth. The council deliberated for 22 minutes. She counted. When they returned, Chairman Webb read the finding with the particular careful neutrality of a man trying to split nothing into 2 equal parts. The financial concerns raised regarding Miss Carter's historical records were not sustained. Her current operation showed no evidence of irresponsibility or misconduct. Her application to expand operations was approved with standard conditions. She heard it. She processed it. She did not let herself react visibly. Not yet. Not in this room. Not with Thomas Whitaker 15 feet away, hearing the same words with a face that had gone very still. She gathered her records. She stacked them neatly. She stood and nodded to the council and turned toward the door. The room was moving around her, the shuffling, the voices starting up. The specific social energy of a crowd that has witnessed something and is beginning to discuss it. She moved through it, without stopping, one foot and then the next, until she was outside in the August air that hit her like something clean after the close interior of the hall. She stopped, pressed one hand flat against her sternum, breathed. She heard the door behind her, footsteps she knew. Lucas came and stood beside her, not touching, just present. The way he was present, solid and quiet and there. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She breathed out. It was shaky, the first thing she'd let herself show since she'd walked into that room 4 hours ago. The first acknowledgement to her own body that the last 11 days had cost something. She felt the shakiness move through her and let it. Because there was nobody watching now except him. "You stood up," she said. "Yes. You said you weren't going to fight my fight." "I said I wasn't going to speak for you," he said. "I didn't say I was going to sit down while someone lied about who you are." She turned and looked at him. He was looking at her in the way he had looked at her since almost the beginning, directly. Without flinching, with the particular honesty of someone who had decided what they saw and was not interested in revising it. She had learned to read that look. She had spent months learning what was behind it. She had known for a while now what was behind it. She had been waiting for the right time to name it. Which was also the wrong time to name it. Which was also now. "Lucas," she said. "Evelyn," he said. She almost laughed. "Almost. We are the two most careful people in Wyoming." "Probably," he agreed. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I don't mean the business. I mean this." She gestured between them, the small emphatic gesture of someone who has spent a long time being precise with language and is frustrated that language isn't working. "I am very practiced at doing things alone. I have had a great deal of practice at that." "So have I," he said. "And I am—" She stopped. Started again. "I have been afraid," she said. "Not of you. Of what it costs. Of what it costs to need something and then lose it. I know what that costs, and I have not been willing." She stopped again. He waited, the way he always waited, without filling the space. Without rushing, just holding it open. "I am not willing to lose this," she said finally. "Whatever this is, I am not willing to be careless with it, because I'm afraid. That's not—" She looked at him. "That's not who I want to be." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out, and with the same careful deliberateness, he applied to everything that mattered. Took her hand, not a gesture, not a performance, just a choice. Quiet and complete and absolutely his. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I am not going anywhere. And I am not asking you for anything you're not ready to give. And I am not going to let you navigate whatever Thomas Whitaker does next by yourself." He paused. "I need you to know those things." She looked at their hands. His were larger than hers, rougher, marked by the same kind of work that had marked hers. Two people who had built things alone for a very long time, standing in the August afternoon with their hands together for the first time. "I know," she said softly. "I know all of those things." "Good," he said. Inside the town hall, through the walls, they could hear the sound of voices. The town of Red Hollow, processing what it had just witnessed, beginning to revise the story it had been telling about Evelyn Carter. Some of them grudgingly, some with relief, like people who had known the story was wrong and were glad to be released from it. Some still resistant, still finding the version where Tapas was right more comfortable than the version where they had been unjust. She didn't care about any of them right now. She stood in the afternoon light with Lucas Bennett's hand around hers and let herself, carefully and deliberately, feel what was actually present. The fear was still there. That was honest. The fear of what it cost to need something. The fear of loss as a thing she knew the precise dimensions of. The fear of being wrong about a person the way she had been wrong before. But alongside it, growing steadily, the way her business had grown. The way she grew, one small solid thing built on another, was something that felt very much like trust, and under that quieter and more fundamental. The thing she had not let herself name until now. She named it now. To herself. In the August afternoon, with her hand in his. She named it, and she held it, and she did not pull it back. Behind them, the town hall door opened, and the crowd began filing out. She could hear Thomas Whitaker's voice somewhere in the middle of it, still talking, still performing the version of events in which he had been reasonable, in which this had been about legitimate concerns, in which today had been anything other than what it was. She heard it. She let it pass. Lucas's thumb moved once across the back of her hand. Brief, minimal, deliberate. She tightened her fingers. They stood like that two careful people who had gotten very good at standing alone and were only now learning what it felt like not to until the crowd had dispersed and the August sun had moved across the sky and Red Hollow had returned to its ordinary sounds. Then Evelyn said, "I'm hungry." He looked at her. Something moved in his face that was warm and almost amused. "You have a full kitchen at the Rocking Bee," he said. "I know," she said. "I was thinking I'd cook." He looked at her a moment longer. For who? She met his eyes. "For us," she said. He was quiet for one beat. The look on his face was the same one she had seen in flashes since the beginning, the one beneath the steadiness. The one that was not controlled or maintained, but simply real. "All right," he said. They walked to where the horses were tied. She didn't look back at the town hall. She didn't look at Thomas Whitaker's retreating figure or the notice board or the market square where she had stood for 6 years, in the dirt, with her bread and her persistence and her quiet, exhausted, undefeated hope. She looked forward. The road back to the Rocking Bee was the same road she had ridden 3 mornings a week, for months. She knew every turn of it. But riding it now, with Lucas beside her, and the August light falling warm on her shoulders, and the sound of her own horse's gait steady beneath her, it felt different in a way she couldn't entirely account for and didn't try to. Some differences were not meant to be analyzed. They were meant to be lived. She let the road carry her forward. Behind her, Red Hollow continued doing what Red Hollow always did, talking, watching, deciding what the day had meant. She could not control what story they chose to tell about her now. She had never been able to control that. But she knew something she had not known that morning with the same solid certainty. She knew it now. Riding forward into the afternoon, on a road she recognized. The story she was living was no longer the one they were telling. It was something else entirely. Something that was only just beginning. She cooked that evening until the Rocking Bee kitchen smelled like everything she had ever wanted her life to be. Not because she was performing contentment. Not because she was trying to fill the silence with busyness the way she sometimes had in her farmhouse. Using work as insulation against the thoughts that got too loud after dark. She cooked because she was genuinely, specifically happy, in a way she had not been in so long. That the sensation required identification. She had to stand at the stove for a moment and recognize it. Name it. Make sure she wasn't confusing it with relief or exhaustion, or the particular lightness that follows a sustained period of dread. It was happiness. Simple and real and hers. Lucas sat at the kitchen table and did not offer to help, which she had come to understand was his form of respect he had learned. In the months of watching her work, that her kitchen was where she was most completely herself, and that offering to help was offering to interrupt something, not assist it. He sat with a cup of coffee and the ranch's account ledger, which he went through in the quiet, methodical way. He went through everything. And occasionally they talked, and occasionally they didn't, and the silence, when it was there, was the kind that belongs to people who have stopped needing to fill space with sound. She made the short rib, the slow braised one with dried cherry and rosemary. The recipe she had developed back in the summer, thinking about what Lucas would say when he tasted it. The recipe she had made a note to stop developing, and had not stopped. She made bread from the morning's dough she'd brought in a covered bowl. She made a simple custard because she wanted something sweet and the Rocking Bee's dairy was too good not to use. When she set the plate in front of him, he closed the ledger. He took a bite. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her with that direct, honest look and said, "This is the best thing you've ever made." She sat down across from him. "You say that every time. Every time it's true," he said. She laughed, and this time she did not pull it back. They ate together in the kitchen that had been Clara's. That was becoming hers in a different way, a layered way. And she thought about what it meant to inhabit a space that held someone else's memory alongside your own presence. She had worried about that. In the early weeks of using the kitchen, had worried that she was displacing something, that her activity in this room was an intrusion on a grief that wasn't hers to disturb. She had stopped worrying about it sometime in July, when she had come in one morning to find that Lucas had oiled the hinges on the kitchen door without being asked. Because it had started to stick, because he had noticed it stuck when she arrived with her hands full. And he had fixed it without mentioning it, and she had noticed it was fixed without mentioning it. And neither of them had said a word about it, because they had both understood that it was simply what you did when you were paying attention to someone. That was when she had stopped worrying about displacement. "Thomas is going to appeal the council decision," Lucas said. He said it the way he delivered most difficult information, directly, without softening, but also without alarm, as a fact that required response rather than a catastrophe that required reaction. She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Cal Brantley told one of my men this afternoon." Apparently Thomas was on his way to Cheyenne before the town hall door had finished closing. He knows someone on the Territorial Commerce Board. He's going to file a formal complaint about the council's conduct. He looked at his plate. He's claiming the hearing was compromised because of my presence. Evelyn absorbed that. He's saying you influenced the outcome, she said. He's saying a wealthy rancher used his position to manipulate a local council, which is not entirely inaccurate, in the way that things are never entirely inaccurate when someone who is good at this tells them. He paused. "I did stand up and speak. I did have influence in that room. Those things are true. You told the truth," she said. "I told the truth in a way Thomas couldn't match because he wasn't in possession of any. But he's going to frame my involvement as coercion." He looked at her steadily. "This isn't over." She was quiet for a moment. She picked up her fork. "Put it down again. How bad could it get? A territorial commerce complaint could freeze your expansion approval until it's resolved. That could take months." He was choosing his words the way she chose ingredients carefully. "For accuracy, it won't reverse what happened today, but it could slow you down significantly." She sat with that. The part of her that had been afraid for 11 to start calculating, to do something with the information right now. She made herself sit still and let it settle first, because she had learned that the first response to a blow was usually not the best one. "Why does he hate me this much?" she said finally. Not rhetorically. She actually wanted to understand it. Lucas considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything she said seriously, which was something she had come to value in a way she hadn't anticipated, not because other people had been dismissive, but because seriousness felt like its own form of care. "I don't think it's about you specifically," he said. "I think you became the thing he pointed to. When his business went unchallenged, he could tell a story about himself, that he was dominant because he was superior, that the people who struggled around him, cause they were lesser. You rebuilding, you succeeding, you standing up in that market square and saying what you said after he knocked your bread down." He paused. "That challenges the story he's been telling himself for 20 years. And men who have built their self-regard on a false story will do extraordinary damage to protect it." She looked at him. "That's a very precise diagnosis. I've had time to think about it," he said. "While I was doing nothing productive for 11 days, waiting for a hearing that should never have been called." She heard the feeling underneath that, not quite anger, but something adjacent. The particular frustration of a person who is disciplined enough to wait but honest enough to acknowledge that the waiting cost something. Lucas, she said. Are you all right? He looked at her. I should be asking you that. You should, she agreed. But I'm asking you. He was quiet for a moment that was longer than his usual pauses. He set down his fork. He looked at the table, and then at her, and she saw something move through his face that he usually kept very well managed. I am angry, he said. I am angrier than is practical or useful. I have spent 6 months watching a man systematically try to destroy something you built with your own hands. And I have managed to be reasonable about it, because you asked me to let the work answer, and you were right to ask that, and I believe you were right. He stopped. And I am still angry. Both things are true. Something in her chest tightened in a way that was not unpleasant. Both things can be true, she said. Yes, he said. I'm aware. She reached across the table and briefly, the way he had briefly taken her hand outside the town hall, covered his with hers. He looked down at her hand. Then he turned his over and held it. Not briefly this time. We will handle the territorial complaint, she said. Together. You said you're not going anywhere, and I believe you. So we handle it together. He looked at her. You said you didn't know how to let someone stay. I'm learning, she said. His hand tightened around hers. Just slightly. So am I, he said. They sat like that for a moment. Two people who had each spent years mastering the architecture of being alone, learning together slowly, without rushing, with the particular carefulness of people who understood the cost of getting it wrong, what it felt like to be two. Then Evelyn said, Eat your short rib before it gets cold. He almost smiled. He picked up his fork. She picked up hers. They ate. The territorial complaint arrived in official form 3 weeks later. It was addressed to Chairman Webb, copied to the 5 council members. And it was as precisely constructed as she had expected. Thomas had found someone who knew the correct language. Because Thomas always found someone who knew the correct language. The complaint alleged procedural irregularities in the August 14th hearing, specifically the unsolicited testimony of a financially interested party, specifically one Lucas James Bennett, whose commercial relationship with the respondent constituted a conflict sufficient to call the council's finding into question. It was clever. She had to admit that. It didn't say Lucas had lied. It said the process had been compromised by his presence. It kept Thomas completely out of the picture as the complainant and focused entirely on the hearing's conduct. Anyone reading it without context might find it reasonable. Chairman Webb sent her a copy with a handwritten note at the bottom. Miss Carter, I want you to know that this council stands by its finding. But I am required to forward this to the territorial office. I am sorry for the trouble. She appreciated the note. She also appreciated that Webb had not pretended the complaint was without teeth. She sat at the rocking bee kitchen table, her table now in every practical sense, and read the complaint 3 times. Then she put it face down on the table and said to no one in particular, since Lucas had not arrived yet, All right, Thomas. You want to play this out? We'll play it out. Lucas arrived 20 minutes later. She handed him the complaint without speaking. He read it, standing at the kitchen counter. She watched his face, the controlled stillness, the small movement at his jaw that meant something, the deliberate measured breath he took before he set it down. He's going for the arrangement, Lucas said. The commercial relationship between us. He's going to argue that my financial interest in your success constitutes bias, which makes my testimony coercive, which makes the council's finding tainted. Can he make that argument stick? With the right person at the territorial level? Possibly. He looked at her. We need to understand something about the commercial arrangement. On paper, I supply you with goods and you supply my workers with meals. That relationship is documented and clean. But Thomas is going to argue that the financial dependency runs deeper, that you have an incentive to please me beyond the business terms, and that I have an incentive to protect you because my operation benefits from yours. She understood immediately. He's going to argue that the arrangement is personal masquerading as professional. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. It started professional, she said. I know, he said. It is still professional, she said. The business terms are real and clean and independent of anything else. I know that too, he said. And then carefully, but is that still all it is? She looked at him. He looked back. Not with any pressure, not with any agenda she could read except honesty, which had always been his only agenda with her. No, she said. It's not still all it is. No, he agreed quietly. It's not. They sat in the particular weight of that mutual acknowledgement for a moment. Then Evelyn straightened in her chair. Which means Thomas has a point, she said. Not the one he thinks he has. Not about manipulation or coercion or procedural irregularity. But the arrangement did become something more than business. And if we're going to defend against his complaint, we need to be honest about that rather than pretending it didn't happen. Lucas looked at her. You want to be honest about it. Publicly. I want to be honest about it with the territorial office, she said. With Webb. With whoever needs to understand what this is. Because the alternative is building a defense on a half-truth. And I have spent 6 years refusing to do that, and I am not starting now. She held his gaze. But I need to know that you're willing to do that. Because it changes what people know about you too. Not just me. He was quiet for a moment. Evelyn, he said. I stood up in front of this town's council chamber and said what I said in front of every person in that room. I am not a man who does things he is unwilling to acknowledge afterward. She held his gaze for another moment. No, she said, you're not. Tell me what you need, he said. What she needed turned out to be a letter. She wrote it herself. Over the course of 2 evenings, because the writing of it mattered as much as the content, the precision of it, the honesty of it, the refusal to be either defensive or apologetic about what it contained. She wrote it at her farmhouse kitchen table, not the rocking bee, because some things needed to be done in the space that was most completely hers. The letter addressed the territorial complaint directly. It acknowledged Lucas's financial relationship with her operation. It acknowledged that the relationship had developed beyond professional terms. She wrote this clearly and without euphemism. Because euphemism was Thomas's weapon and she refused to use it. She documented the timeline, the business arrangement first, the personal development later, the clear and continued separation between the terms of their commercial agreement and anything else. She argued that a person who has a relationship with another person is not automatically compromised when they speak truthfully on their behalf, and that the alternative requiring that only strangers could speak on a person's behalf was a standard that would silence every honest witness in every proceeding in Wyoming. Lucas read it when she was done. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his most unguarded, the one that was not quite a smile, but held everything a smile held. Compressed into something quieter. This is very good, he said. It's honest, she said. Yes, he said. That's what makes it good. He wrote his own accompanying letter. She read it. It was shorter than hers, characteristically. Lucas Bennett did not use 10 words when 5 would do, but it was precise and direct, and it said, among other things, that he had made no threat or offer of commercial incentive to any member of the Red Hollow Town Council, that his testimony had been voluntary and unsolicited, and that his relationship with Miss Carter, in whatever form it took, did not alter the factual content of what he had said. He signed it without hesitation. They sent both letters to the territorial office the following Friday. What they had not expected, what neither of them had anticipated, in the 12 weeks of managing Thomas Whitaker's escalating campaigns, was who arrived in Red Hollow the following Monday morning. His name was Raymond Aldous. He was a territorial commerce investigator, which was a title that in 1888 Wyoming carried just enough official weight to make people official pay ticket attention. He was a thin, precise man in his 40s who wore a traveling suit that had seen considerable mileage and carried a leather case full of and asked questions with the focus efficiency of someone who had learned that the most information came not from the questions themselves, but from the silences between them. He arrived at Evelyn's farmhouse first. She had not been told he was coming. She answered the door in her working clothes, flour on her hands from the morning's baking, and looked at Raymond Aldous and his leather case and understood immediately what this was. "Miss Carter," he said, "my name is Raymond Aldous. I've been sent by the Territorial Commerce Board to review a complaint regarding the August 14th hearing. Do you have time to speak with me?" She looked at him. He looked back. His expression was neutral in the professional way, which she had learned to distinguish from the personal kind neutral, because he hadn't decided. Not neutral, because he didn't care. "Come in," she said. "I'll put coffee on." "Thank you," he said. He wiped his boots at the door without being asked, which she noted. He asked questions for 2 hours. He asked them carefully and in a sequence that told her he had read both her letter and Lucas's before arriving. He asked about the origins of the commercial arrangement. He asked about the progression of it. He asked about the hearing, specifically what she had presented, who had spoken, what the counsel had said. He asked about Thomas Whitaker. And the question about Thomas was the sharpest one, the one she felt land differently from the others. "Tell me," Aldous said, "in your assessment, what was the purpose of the original complaint that led to the August 14th hearing?" She considered how to answer this. She had her honest assessment, which was detailed and specific, and possibly more than he was asking for. She also had the more careful version, the one that stayed close to provable fact. She chose the honest one. She told him about the bread knocked from her table. She told him about Nora and the approach Thomas had made to her. She told him about the specific timing of Thomas's escalation in direct proportion to her business recovery. She laid it out in the same clear sequential way she had laid out her financial records in front of the council, not as accusation, but as chronology, as evidence of a pattern. Aldous listened. He took notes. His expression remained professionally neutral throughout. When she was done, he said, "Miss Carter, in your opinion, is Lucas Bennett a man of integrity?" She looked at Aldous. She thought about a man who had crouched in the dirt of the market square to examine her ruined bread before he said a single word to her. A man who had offered her a business arrangement with written terms rather than a favor she would feel obligated to return. A man who had told her the truth at every opportunity, even when the truth was uncomfortable. Who had fixed a sticking door hinge without mentioning it. Who had stood up in a council chamber without being asked and said what needed to be said, and then sat back down and let her be herself. "Yes," she said, "he is a man of integrity, in the way that integrity is actually lived, rather than performed, not without complexity, not without feeling, but consistently honest and consistently willing to stand behind what he believes. In my experience, that is rarer than it should be." Aldous looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something in his notes and said, "Thank you. I'd like to speak with Mr. Bennett this afternoon if possible." Lucas, as she found out later, had said less and landed harder. He had answered Aldous's questions with the same directness he applied to everything, neither elaborating where elaboration wasn't needed, nor deflecting where discomfort might have made deflection tempting. When Aldous asked him directly whether he had used commercial leverage to influence the council, Lucas had said, "No, I used accurate information which I delivered without being asked. If the distinction is not clear, I'm happy to explain it again." Aldous had apparently not required the repetition. He spent 2 days in Red Hollow. He spoke to Chairman Webb. He spoke to Alderman Calloway. He spoke to 3 of Lucas's ranch workers and to Nora, who told him about Thomas's approach with the composure of a young woman who had decided some time ago that the truth was the only comfortable position. He spoke, Evelyn learned later, to Cal Brantley, who had apparently been waiting for a reason to say officially what he had been saying privately for months. And on his second afternoon in town, Raymond Aldous walked into Thomas Whitaker's general store. Nobody knew exactly what was said in that conversation. The store had been cleared of customers. Aldous had asked for a private meeting, which Thomas could not reasonably refuse, and his 2 employees had been sent on errands. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. When Aldous came out, His expression was as neutral as it had been throughout. He tipped his hat to the woman crossing the street in front of him, collected his horse from the post, and rode to the edge of town to make his notes. When Thomas Whitaker came out, 20 minutes later, he did not stop to speak to anyone. He crossed the street, climbed into his carriage, and drove home in the middle of the business day for the first time in 11 years. The town noticed. The town noticed everything. Evelyn heard about it from Nora, who heard it from Mrs. Abernathy, who had been on the opposite corner and had seen Thomas's face as he emerged from his store with the unambiguous expression of a man who has been in a room where something has shifted fundamentally in the terms of his life and has not yet processed what it means for everything that comes after. She sat with this information for a long time. She was not happy about it. Not in the way she might have expected to be, back in the market square, with her bread in the dirt, and Thomas's voice performing her inadequacy for 50 witnesses. She had imagined, in some version of herself that felt very far away now, that watching Thomas Whitaker's authority crack would feel like something. Like satisfaction, or vindication, or some version of justice landing the way it was supposed to. What she actually felt was tired, not defeated. That distinction was important. She felt the tiredness of someone who has carried a heavy thing for a very long time and is beginning to understand that they might soon be able to put it down. That tiredness is not the same as exhaustion. It is the tiredness that precedes rest. She was sitting at her kitchen table, feeling this when Lucas knocked on her door that evening. She opened it and looked at him and said, "You heard?" "Yes," he said. "Come in," she said. He came in. He sat at her kitchen table. She made coffee because it was what she did when things needed to be sat with. And she sat across from him, and they were both quiet for a moment. "What do you think Aldous said to him?" she asked. "I think he told him what an investigation into his business practices would look like," Lucas said. "Gerald Pierce and his pricing practices, the approach to Nora, the timing of every piece of interference mapped against your business recovery. Thomas has been doing what he does for 20 years, and he's been doing it without anyone looking directly at it." He paused. When someone who has authority looks directly at it, it doesn't look like reasonable concern anymore. It looks like what it is. "Will it stop?" she said. Lucas was quiet for a moment. "Honest, I think it will slow down significantly. I think Thomas is a man who calculates risk and who has just had his risk calculation revised." He looked at her. "But I also think he's not someone who simply stops. He adapts." She nodded. She had thought the same thing. "Then we adapt too," she said. "Yes," he said. "We do." She looked at him across her kitchen table, the man who had showed up in her market on an ordinary Tuesday and bought everything she had left and changed the mathematics of what she thought was possible. She thought about what she had said to him 2 weeks ago, about learning to let someone stay. She thought about how different it felt to mean something that you said, versus saying something you hoped you could manage to mean. She meant it. That was the thing she had been quietly confirming for weeks. In every small interaction, every morning, that was easier because he existed in her day. Every problem that was less frightening because she was not facing it alone. She meant it with the same certainty she knew her recipe, her own, not from having been told it, but from having tested it, adjusted it, understood it from the inside. "Lucas," she said. "Yes," he said. She smiled. "I'm glad you came back. After that first day, I'm glad you came back." He looked at her across the table. That direct, honest look. "I am too," he said, "every day since." Aldous' report arrived 6 weeks later, forwarded to Chairman Webb with a cover letter and a finding. The Territorial Commerce Board declined to intervene in the August 14th hearing. The board found no evidence of procedural irregularity sufficient to warrant reversal of the council's finding. The board also noted, in language that was careful and official and still managed to be perfectly clear, that the board's review had surfaced questions regarding the conduct of the original complaint's initiator that warranted separate review. Thomas Whitaker received a copy of the same report. He did not come to the market for 2 weeks after that. When he did come, he was quieter. Still present, Thomas Whitaker was not a man who vacated the field entirely, but reduced somehow. Like a volume turned down to a level that could be managed. He did not look at Evelyn's table. He focused on his own stall and spoke to his regular customers, and conducted his business with the particular concentrated energy of someone redirecting their attention. She was aware of him. She would probably always be aware of him. But the quality of her awareness had changed from something watchful and braced to something that was cloaker to ordinary professional caution. He was a competitor. He was not wrong to compete. What he had done had been wrong. The competition itself was not. She could hold both of those things. Her business had continued growing through all of it. Through the complaint, and the letters, and the waiting, and the territorial investigator, and the 6 weeks of not knowing. Her ranch supply service now covered 3 operations beyond Lucas's. A family in the next county had placed a standing weekly order for preserved goods. The Hendersons, the family, with the vegetable wagon, who had always been quietly friendly toward her, had approached her about a supply partnership, trading their produce for her preserved goods at fair exchange rates. Nora had taken on more hours and had learned 3 of Evelyn's core recipes well enough to execute them independently, which meant Evelyn could develop new ones rather than spending all her time reproducing the established ones. The woman who had been standing behind a table with 3 loaves of bread and 4 pies and a pot of stew on the worst Tuesday of her recent memory was running, by any honest measurement, a real business. Not perfect. Not secure in the way that wealthy people were secure. Not protected from bad weather or bad luck, or the 1,000 ordinary challenges that attended any enterprise built in the real world. But real, sustained. Growing one Thursday evening in late October. She was in the Rocking Bee kitchen, finishing the week's preserve order when Lucas came in from the pasture. He was later than usual, and she could see, from the set of his shoulders as he came through the door, that it had been a long afternoon. One of his cattle had gotten through a fence, and he and 2 of his men had spent 3 hours tracking and recovering it and repairing the gap. He came into the kitchen and stopped. She was standing at the stove with her back to him, stirring something that smelled like the inside of a good kitchen in October, warm and complex and particular. She had not heard him come in because she was focused and because the kitchen sounds covered the door. He stood there for a moment without speaking. She turned, felt his presence, found him standing in the doorway, looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not the controlled look, or the direct look, or the almost smile. Something more open than all of those. Something that was, unmistakably, a man looking at a thing he had been afraid to want and finding it present, finding it real, and not knowing immediately what to do with the largeness of that. She looked back at him. "Bad afternoon," she said. "Long one," he said. He came in, hung up his jacket. "The fence is fixed." "Good," she said. She turned back to the stove. "Sit down." 20 minutes, he sat. She listened to the chair pull out. The settling of his weight. The sound of a man making himself at home in a kitchen that had been empty for 4 years. She listened to it and felt it in her chest, in the way she felt things that mattered, not dramatically. Not with fanfare, but deep and specific and real. 20 minutes later, she set a plate in front of him. He looked at it, then up at her. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said. She sat down with her own plate. "I wanted to." He looked at his food for a moment. Then at her. He said, "Lucas," she said. He looked at her with the most unguarded expression she had ever seen on his face. No maintenance. No management, just the man himself, tired and present, and feeling something that his face had clearly decided to stop being careful about. "I want to ask you something," he said. Her heart made a single definitive movement in her chest. "Ask." He was quiet for just a moment, the particular quiet of a man choosing words with care. Not because he is uncertain what he means, but because what he means is important enough to deserve precision. "I want to ask you to stay," he said. "Not for the kitchen. Not for the arrangement. I want to ask you to stay because this house has been quiet for 4 years and you have made it something else, and I would like." He stopped. Started again. "I am not good at this," he said. "You're doing fine," she said softly. He looked at her. "I would like you to stay, as is the person this is. Not the arrangement. The person." The kitchen was absolutely still. She looked at Lucas Bennett, who had crouched in the dirt to examine her bread, who had brought coffee without ceremony, who had fixed a sticking door hinge without mentioning it, who had stood up in a council chamber and told the truth and sat back down, who had held her hand outside the town hall in August sunlight, who had been alone for 4 years in a house too large and too quiet, and had decided, carefully and completely, that he did not want to be alone anymore. She thought about what it meant to stay, the real meaning of it, not the easy version. To stay was to choose something with your eyes open, knowing the risk, knowing the cost, knowing that staying meant making yourself available to loss in ways that not staying protected you from. She had been not staying for 6 years. She was so tired of not staying. "Yes," she said. He looked at her, just to confirm it, that she meant it the way he'd asked it. "Yes," she said again. He reached across the table. She met him halfway. She moved the last of her things from the farmhouse on a Saturday morning in November. Not all at once, that was not how Evelyn Carter did things. She moved deliberately, one careful load at a time, the way she had always built anything that mattered. Her mother's recipe tin went first, wrapped in a cloth and placed in the rocking bee kitchen on the shelf directly above the stove, where she could reach it without looking. Her tools went next, the good knives, the copper pot that had survived 2 winters and a dishonest merchant and still held its heat evenly, the wooden spoon her mother had used until the handle wore smooth. Last came the small things that were harder to name. A particular chair she liked to sit in when she was thinking, a quilt her father had kept folded at the foot of his bed, the tin box where she stored correspondence. Lucas helped with the heavier items without being asked and without making a ceremony of it, which was, she had come to understand, simply how he expressed care through the practical doing of things that needed doing. He carried her storage trunk up the stairs of the rocking bee without commentary, set it where she gestured, and went back downstairs to help with the next thing. When the wagon was empty and the farmhouse stood behind them, with its door closed for the last time, Evelyn stopped. She looked at it. Lucas stopped beside her. She had spent 6 years in that farmhouse fighting for something she believed in, alone and mostly doubted, and sometimes doubting herself. She had lit that stove before dawn on mornings when she was too tired to feel anything. She had sat at that kitchen table at 2 in the morning recalculating margins that refused to work. She had stood at that window on the day Daniel Marsh left and watched him go, and understood that she was entirely on her own and would remain so for a very long time. She had also, in that farmhouse, become someone she respected. "Thank you," she said quietly. Not to Lucas, not anyone specific. Just to the house, to the 6 years, to the version of herself who had refused to stay down. Lucas did not ask who she was talking to. He stood beside her and was quiet with her for the appropriate amount of time. And then he said, "Ready?" "Yes," she said. She did not look back. The rocking bee changed in the way that houses change when they go from being occupied to being lived in gradually. Specifically, in dozens of small ways that no one decision could account for. Evelyn's herbs appeared near the kitchen door, planted in a row with the practicality of a woman who used them daily and wanted them close. A second set of hooks appeared near the entrance for her coats and baskets. The kitchen smelled different, not replacing what it had been, but layering over it, the way time layers over grief without erasing it. Something new and warm and entirely present. Lucas noticed all of it. He said very little about it, which meant more to her than commentary would have. What he did say, one evening in early December, when she had been there 3 weeks, and the house had begun to feel like the word home rather than the word arrangement, was this: "Clara would not have been threatened by you." Evelyn looked up from the bread she was scoring. "I know some people worry about that," he said. He was at the table with the ledger, as he often was in the evenings, whether the person who comes after is in competition with the person who was there before. Clara would not have thought of it that way. He paused. She was a woman who understood that love was not a finite resource, that there was not a fixed amount of it, and that caring for one person did not diminish what you had felt for another. He looked at her steadily. "I thought you should know that." She set down her knife. She looked at him across the kitchen, this quiet, precise man who had been carrying 4 years of careful grief and had decided, without fanfare, to set it down and reach for something new. She thought about what it cost to say what he had just said, what it required in terms of honesty and courage and the particular willingness to be vulnerable that some people spent their whole lives avoiding. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me. You needed to hear it," he said simply. He picked up his pen. "The bread is going to overproof if you don't finish scoring it." She turned back to the bread. She was smiling. The news that Evelyn Carter had moved into the Rocking Bee reached Red Hollow within 48 hours, which was approximately 46 hours faster than she had expected and 2 hours slower than Lucas had predicted. They had discussed it beforehand, not whether to be honest about it, because neither of them had any interest in the alternative, but how to manage the information in a town that had spent years constructing a specific narrative about Evelyn and would now be required to revise it. "Let them talk," Evelyn had said. "They're going to talk regardless of what we do. At least this way they're talking about something that's true." "Agreed," Lucas had said. "I'm not interested in managing anyone's opinion about my life." And so they had not managed it. They had simply lived it, openly and without apology. And the town had done what towns do: talked, speculated, divided along the familiar lines of those who had always quietly rooted for Evelyn and those who had found Thomas Whitaker's version of her more comfortable to believe. The division was different now than it would have been a year ago. That was the thing Evelyn noticed first, and then noticed herself, noticing the proportion had shifted. The people who came to her table on Tuesday and Saturday mornings were not just the quiet sympathizers anymore. There were new faces, confident and deliberate, people who had watched what happened at the town council and drawn their own conclusions about who in Red Hollow was worth doing business with. Her sales that November exceeded anything she had recorded since she started keeping records. She did not celebrate this out loud. She wrote the numbers in her account book with the same precision she always applied, and went back to work. But she held the numbers quietly in herself, the way you hold things that confirm something you needed, confirmed, not triumphantly, but with a particular relief. She had not been wrong about herself. That was what the numbers said. She had not been wrong all along. Thomas Whitaker was still there, still operating, still the dominant merchant in Red Hollow, in terms of scale and history. The territorial board's separate review of his conduct had resulted in what Aldous had described, in a letter to Chairman Webb, as a formal notation of concerned bureaucratic language for something that had real teeth without being a full censure. Thomas was not ruined. He was not removed. He was, for the first time in his commercial life in Red Hollow, operating under scrutiny. And scrutiny, for a man who had built his dominance on the absence of it, was its own significant consequence. He did not come to speak to Evelyn. She did not go to speak to him. That chapter had said everything it had to say. What she had not anticipated, what ambushed her entirely on a Tuesday morning in late November, was Daniel Marsh. She was setting up her table when she heard his voice, behind her. Not speaking to her. Speaking to someone else. The voice carrying the particular projection of a man who knows he is being overheard and is performing for the audience he knows is there. She recognized it instantly, the way you recognize a sound that was once part of the architecture of your daily life and is now completely foreign to it. She turned. Daniel was 30 feet away, talking to a hardware merchant, but his eyes had already found her. He looked different in the way that people who have made choices that didn't pan out look different. Not old, not diminished, but altered. The particular confidence that had always been his most visible quality was still present, but had a different texture, now less easy, more maintained. He crossed the distance between them with the deliberate pace of a man who has decided to do something and has not entirely finished convincing himself. "Evelyn," he said. "Daniel," she said. She kept her hands moving on the table display. Not as performance. She genuinely needed to finish setting up. And she was not going to interrupt her work for this conversation. He stood in the position of a customer who was not buying anything. "I heard you're doing well." "I am," she said. "The business." And he paused. "Lucas Bennett." She looked at him then. Directly. "Yes," she said, "Lucas Bennett." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him put words together and take them apart and put different ones together. She recognized the process. He had watched him do it many times when they were together. The mental drafting and redrafting that preceded anything he found difficult to say. "I made a mistake," he said finally. She looked at him steadily. "Leaving," he said. "The way I did. I made a mistake." She thought about all the versions of herself that had needed to hear that. The version at 2 in the morning, going through her finances, alone. The version who had watched him ride away from her farmhouse and stood at the window, understanding that she was now completely by herself. The version who had spent the following months hearing the town interpret his departure as confirmation of her inadequacy. All of those versions had needed to hear it. This version standing at her market table on a Tuesday morning in November with 8 months of clean accounts in her cash box and the rocking bee behind her and Lucas Bennett's hand in her memory did not need it in the same way. "I know you did," she said, not unkindly, not coldly. Just honestly. He blinked slightly. He had expected something else. She could see. More emotion perhaps, or more ice, either the wound still open or the door slammed definitively shut. He had not expected this specific register, which was the register of a woman who had processed her grief about this fully and moved comprehensively past it. Evelyn Daniel. She folded the cloth over her display with precision. "I believe you that it was a mistake. And I believe you mean that sincerely. Not just because things didn't work out the way you expected. I think you genuinely feel it." She looked at him. "But I need you to understand something. Whatever I lost when you left, and I did lose something, that was real. I built something better in the space it left. Not better because you left. Just better because I was finally forced to build it entirely on my own terms." She paused. "What you did is not something I need you to apologize for anymore. It led somewhere I wouldn't trade." He looked at her for a long moment. "He's a good man," he said finally. It came out with a complexity she wasn't going to try to fully unpack. "Yes," she said simply, "he is." Daniel nodded once. Slowly, the nod of a man absorbing information that reorganizes something in his understanding. Then he said, "I'm glad you're well, Evelyn." "I am well," she said. Genuinely, he walked away. She watched him go, and she felt not triumph, not vindication, nothing that had his name on it at all. She felt, clearly, and specifically, the finality of something that had been pending for a long time. The closing of a door that had been standing open, confident not because she wanted to go back through it, but because she had never quite gotten around to shutting it. She shut it now. She turned back to her table. A woman she didn't recognize was standing in front of her display, examining the bread with the focused attention of a serious buyer. Young mid-20s. Maybe with capable hands, and a direct way of looking at things that Evelyn found immediately recognizable. "Second rise," the woman said. Evelyn looked at her. "The crust," the woman said. "You do a second rise." "I do," Evelyn said. "I've been trying to get mine right for 2 years," the woman said. She looked up. "Could I ask you something about the technique?" Evelyn looked at her. At the capable hands and the serious eyes and the particular hunger of someone who was trying to build something and couldn't quite get one piece of it right. "Buy the loaf," Evelyn said. "I'll tell you while I wrap it." The woman bought the loaf. Evelyn talked her through the second rise, not just the mechanics, but the way the gluten needed the rest, the way the yeast needed the second activation, the way patience was not optional in bread making, and the people who tried to rush it always paid for it in the crust. The woman listened with the focused attention of someone filing information in a place they intended to access often. When she left, Evelyn watched her go and felt something she didn't immediately name. Then she named it: responsibility, the forward-facing kind. The kind that comes from having built something and understanding that what you've built carries an obligation not just to maintain it, but to pass something of it forward. She thought about that on the ride home that evening. She mentioned it to Lucas at dinner. He listened, as he always did, with the full attention that was one of the things she valued most in him, not the performance of listening, not the half-present nod of someone waiting for a pause to speak, but actual sustained attention, the kind that made her feel that what she said mattered. "You want to teach," he said. She turned the word over. "I want to share what I know, in a structured way. Not just talking someone through bread technique while I wrap their loaf." She looked at him. "I've been thinking about what the kitchen could support, what the space could do beyond my own operation." He was quiet for a moment. "Tell me what you're imagining," she told him. It was not fully formed. It was the kind of idea that was still in its first rise, still developing structure, but the shape of it was clear. She wanted to use the rocking bee kitchen on the mornings she wasn't using it herself to hold what she was thinking of as working sessions. Not formal classes, not anything with a name that required official sanction. Just women who wanted to learn coming to a kitchen where someone was willing to teach. The way she herself had learned, from her mother, at a kitchen table, with the knowledge passed directly from one pair of hands to another. Lucas listened to all of it. Then he said, "The storage room off the east side of the kitchen. I've been using it for equipment. I could clear it. It would give you room for 2 additional workstations if you put a proper surface in." She looked at him. "You'd do that. It's practical," he said, "and it's right." He met her eyes. "You spent 6 years with no one who believed in what you were building. I can think of 10 women in this county who are in the same position right now. If you can change that for even 2 or 3 of them." He stopped. "Yes," he said, "I'd do that." She reached across the table. He was already reaching toward her. The first working session happened on a Thursday morning in January. 3 women. The young woman from the market, her name was Sarah. And Evelyn had discovered, a natural instinct for flavor that only needed technique to become something extraordinary. A widow from the next settlement who had been trying to restart a household income since her husband's death and had heard about Evelyn through the ranching network Lucas had cultivated. And unexpectedly, Nora, who had been working with Evelyn for months and knew most of the techniques already, but who came anyway and spent the morning passing on what she knew to the other 2 women with a patience and clarity that made Evelyn look at her across the kitchen and think, "She is going to be very good at this." They worked for 4 hours. They made bread and a preserved tomato sauce and a slow-cooked beef dish that required 3 hours in the oven and which they tasted at noon, standing around the kitchen counter with spoons, without ceremony. Sarah closed her eyes when she tasted it. "That's it," she said. "That's what I've been trying to do." Evelyn looked at her at the closed eyes and the expression of someone who has just understood something they have been reaching for and felt something she could only describe as full. Not satisfied in the finished way, but full in the continuing way. Like a kitchen actively in use. Like a thing still happening. "Keep the recipe," Evelyn said. "Adjust it when you know it well enough to adjust it. It's yours now." Sarah opened her eyes. Just like that," Evelyn said. "That's how it's supposed to work." Spring came to Red Hollow the way it always came, slowly. Then suddenly, the ground shifting from frozen to possible, under your feet, without obvious announcement. Evelyn was in the rocking bee kitchen on a Thursday morning in April when Lucas came in with his coat still on and the expression of a man who has been turning something over all morning and has finally decided to say it. She knew that expression well by now. She set down her spoon. "What?" He came to the table. He sat down, which was unusual at this hour when he was typically working. He put both hands flat on the table, which was the posture of a man grounding himself. "I want to ask you something," he said. Her heart did the thing it did. Ask, he looked at her. I asked you to stay, he said. You said yes. That answer, I need to know if it still means what it meant when you said it. She looked at him, confused for a moment. Of course it does. I need to know, he said carefully. Because what I want to ask is something larger than staying. And I won't ask it if the answer to the first question has changed. She understood then. She understood what he was asking with the words, before the words. The same way she understood everything about him, from the inside. From having paid attention, she felt the largeness of it land in her chest, with a weight that was not heavy but was very real. Lucas, she said. Tell me honestly, he said. Not what you think I want to hear. You. She looked at this man who had crouched in the dirt to examine her bread, who had brought coffee without ceremony, who had told her both things could be true, who had stood up in a council chamber and sat back down, who had oiled the door hinge and cleared a storage room and sat across from her at a kitchen table and asked her how she felt about things like someone who genuinely needed to know, who had been alone for 4 years in a house too large and had kept the faith anyway, had maintained the kitchen that was Clara's, had waited without knowing he was waiting for something worth opening it for. She thought about what she had been 6 years ago. The woman with the crumbling farmhouse, and her mother's recipes, and a determination so fierce it sometimes frightened her. She thought about every morning she had gotten up when she didn't want to. Every mistake she had documented honestly. Every time the town had called her a failure and she had gone home and argued with the voice in her own head that was starting to agree. She thought about who she was now. Not because of him. That was the important thing. The thing she needed to be clear about, not because of him, but alongside him. He had not made her. He had been present while she made herself. And that was an entirely different thing, and it was the right thing. The only thing she would have accepted. She looked at him. Ask me, she said. He reached into his jacket. He produced a ring small, simple, a single stone set in plain silver. The kind of ring chosen by a man who understood that the woman he was giving it to would be working with her hands every day and needed something that would not interfere with the work. She registered all of this in the moment it took him to set it on the table between them. Evelyn Carter, he said. Will you marry me? He said it without a question mark. She noticed that. Not a performance, not a plea, not an uncertainty looking for reassurance. A question asked by a man who was certain of what he was asking, and certain of who he was asking, and was waiting only for her answer. She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about everything it meant to say yes. Not the surface meaning. The surface meaning was clear, and she wanted it completely. She thought about the deep meaning, the staying, the choosing. Every day in the ordinary moments, not just the large ones. The opening of yourself to loss in the full knowledge of what loss costs. Because you have decided that the alternative, the careful distance, the managed solitude, the safety of not risking, is a cost you are no longer willing to pay. She had been paying it for 6 years. She was done paying it. Yes, she said. He picked up the ring. She held out her hand, the hand with the flower on it. The hand that had made bread in the dark on the worst mornings. The hand that had held the records that proved she was honest. The hand that had reached across tables toward him more times than she had counted. He put the ring on her finger with the same careful deliberateness he applied to everything that mattered to him. It fit. Of course it fit. He was a man who paid attention. She looked at it on her hand for a moment. The silver caught the morning light coming through the kitchen window, Clara's kitchen. Her kitchen. Theirs now, the way everything here had become, theirs now, in the layered and honest and continuing way. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that expression, the open one. The one beneath all the steadiness, the one that had no maintenance in it and no management. Just the man himself, present and choosing. It fits, she said. I know, he said. She stood up. He stood. She crossed the small distance, that was no distance at all by now, and put her arms around him, and held on with the specific strength of a woman who knows how to hold something and intends to hold this for as long as holding is possible. He held her back. His arms were solid and certain, and there, the way he was always there. They stood like that in the kitchen for a long moment. No words necessary, no performance required outside. Red Hollow was conducting its ordinary Tuesday business. The market would be opening. Her customers would be arriving at her table, which Nora was managing this morning, which she could do now because Evelyn had built something large enough to share. The territorial complaint was resolved. The spring supply orders were already filled 3 weeks out. Sarah had sold her first batch of preserved goods to a hotel in the next county and had come to tell Evelyn, with a face full of the particular luminous shock of a person who has done something for the first time and cannot quite believe it counted. That was the life that was waiting outside this kitchen. It was a good life, a real life, built from nothing, by hands that kept working through every reason to stop, documented honestly, defended publicly, expanded carefully, shared forward. She pulled back slightly and looked at him. He looked at her. "We should eat something," she said. "Before the morning gets away." He almost smiled. The full version, the one she had been watching, emerged slowly all these months. The one that changed his face and showed her what was underneath all the steadiness. "You're going to feed me every day for the rest of our lives." "Aren't you?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "I am." He did smile then. "All the good," he said. She turned back to the stove. He sat back down at the table. The kitchen filled with the sounds and smells of an ordinary morning bread proving. Braise simmering, coffee strong and present, the particular living warmth of a space in full use. Two people moving through the same room with the ease of people who have learned each other's rhythms and find them compatible. Comfortable in the specific way that is not ordinary comfort, but the kind built from time and honesty and the choice to keep choosing. The woman who had stood in the dirt of the Red Hollow market, with her ruined bread around her feet and 50 people watching and not one of them stepping forward, that woman was here. She was still here. She had not been replaced or rescued or remade. She had simply continued, one morning at a time, until the morning became this one. And in this kitchen, in this life, with this man who had seen her work before he judged her, and had not stopped seeing her clearly, since she was not a failure waiting to be proven right. She was a woman who had written her own story to its proper ending. And the ending was not an ending at all. It was the best kind of beginning.